Dear brothers and sisters, I'd like to try to relate some themes with the help of God's grace this afternoon, which help us, I hope, to understand Our Lady a little bit better and to love her more ardently and to be closer to her. These are the themes of light and beauty, the idea of gazing at Mary and then gazing with Mary, the notion of loving her and being united to her, and being guided by her and prepared by her for union with God. I want to take as my starting point a beautiful message by Cardinal Piacenza, Prefect of the Congregation for Clergy, which was published on the 28th of November, just a few days ago. His message for Advent. He writes, "The Virgin lived constantly in prayerful vigilance. In vigilance, she received the announcement that changed the history of humanity. In vigilance, she kept and contemplated, more than any other, the Almighty who became her Son. In vigilance, filled with loving and grateful wonder, she gave birth to the light itself." Isn't that a beautiful expression? She gave birth to the light himself. That is, she gave birth, of course, to Jesus Christ, whom one of the prophets acknowledges as the true Son of Justice. And thus Mary is the dawn, for the dawn precedes and, as it were, gives birth to the sun, which lights up the whole world. Now, as dawn, Mary is luminous and beautiful. The dawn heralds the advent of the sun, not just because we know that when dawn approaches, the sun is soon to be seen, but also because the dawn already possesses in itself some of the qualities of the sun and of the day, such as luminosity and beauty. Now we recognize Mary's brightness, her luminosity, and her beauty in a special way in the mystery of her Immaculate Conception. And thus we see how the mystery of the Immaculate Conception leads in some ways to Mary's divine maternity and the coming of the true Son of Justice, Christ the Lord. Developing this idea, St. Louis de Montfort spoke of the Incarnation as almost a necessary consequence of the Immaculate Conception, Mary's singular fullness of grace. In simple terms, the Son of God, gazing upon Mary's beauty, wanted very much to become her son, uniting her to himself as his own mother. Perhaps we can discern a reference to this desire of God with respect to his mother in Psalm 44. "Hear, O daughter, consider and incline your ear. Forget your people and your father's house, and the king will desire your beauty." Mary is the daughter who, because of her immeasurable grace as immaculate, forgot her people and the house of her father. That is, she lived with her mind and her heart wholly centered upon God and upon things divine, and thus became supremely desirable to the King, our Lord Jesus Christ. But dear brothers and sisters, we must not think that the fact that Mary's mind and heart were perfectly centered upon God means that she was or is less close to us, her fellow creatures. In the book of Canticles, the bride says of herself, "I was a wall and my breasts were like towers." Chapter 8 of the Song of Songs. According to St. Anthony, the two breasts of the beloved bride are her love for God and her love for neighbor. In fact, where genuine love for God increases, true love for one's neighbor also always increases. And both of these loves make one delightful to God. If someone wished to say, though, that the dawn is what it is precisely because of the sun, which is about to appear, I would agree. And this truth we can also apply to Jesus and Mary. For Mary is what she is in function of the Son, that is, S-O-N, she is to bear. Christ, in fact, is the first principle of our Mariology. If we wish to understand Mary truly and correctly, we must always keep in mind the dignity of her Son, for whom she was formed and created. With regard to the matter we are considering, it is eminently appropriate that the one who was to give birth to the light be immaculate, that is, untouched by any stain or shadow of sin. And thus, after having said that Mary's immaculate conception in some ways follows from the mystery of the divine maternity, we can also say that Mary's divine maternity is in some sense a cause of her immaculate conception. In God's love for Mary and in the mystery of her immaculate conception, we can discern an important lesson. It is this: if we wish to be close to Christ, if we want him to take us among his special friends and confidants, we must strive to rid ourselves of every stain and shadow of sin, that is, to become like Mary. For there can be no fellowship between light and darkness, and if we wish to be pleasing to God, we must remove sin from our hearts, from our minds. How do we do this? How do we remove sin so as to become immaculate like Mary? We need to cultivate the life of grace within us. We need to grow ever more rich in grace until we share in a full measure in her immaculateness. So how then do we cultivate this life of grace, make the grace which is in us, sanctifying grace, grow ever stronger? Well, Mary is the mediatrix of all grace, and Mary is the Virgin-made Church. And thus, to grow in grace, we must be close to Mary, and we must be a true child of the Church. As regards this latter point, being a true child of the Church, children, especially very little ones, are clothed and fed and taught by their mothers. And so we need to be in respect of the Church. That is, we need to be clothed with the robe of grace by holy baptism or perhaps by confession. If we happen to commit a mortal sin, we go to confession to be given back the beautiful garment, as it were, of grace. And we need to be nourished with the most blessed sacrament of the altar. And we need to be taught by sound doctrine, that is, by the true teaching of the Church, avoiding everything that is intended merely to please, or that has about it some other quality that belongs to falsehood. So we reject things which are a question of mere fashion. So, for example, the errors of those who teach centering prayer, for example. This is something which differs quite a lot from the true understanding of prayer in the tradition of the Church. For we are not trying to become divine by releasing some spirit which is within us, as that poor soul Thomas Merton thought, but we become divinized by receiving God's grace and cooperating with it and being transformed within by this holy gift from God, which involves virtue and care in the practice of our duties of our state in life. Now, as regards being close to Mary, we must be like little children. For the smaller a child is, the closer it tends to be to its mother. One of the loveliest moments in the life of any mother is when her little one first begins to fix his gaze upon her face. And perhaps he smiles at her too. We must do this with Mary, our truest mother. For St. Maximilian Kolbe, a habit of continually looking to Mary is absolutely necessary that one's life might bear the fruit that God desires. We do well, first of all, to look to Mary in moments of trial, tribulation, or temptation. And here we remember the beautiful words of the great Saint Bernard of Clairvaux. In one of his sermons he writes, "O you who find yourself tossed about by the storms of life, turn not your eyes from the brightness of this star, that is Mary. If you would not be overwhelmed by its boisterous waves, if the winds of temptation rise, if you fall among the rocks of tribulations, look up at the star, call on Mary. If anger, covetousness, or other passions beat on the vessel of your soul, look up to Mary. If you begin to sink in the gulf of melancholy and despair, think on Mary. In dangers, in distress, in perplexities, think on Mary, call on Mary." And we know from a famous prayer that no one who invoked Mary from the depths of their heart was ever left without assistance. But there is a way in which we can and should gaze at Mary. It is the gaze, another way that is, it is the gaze of one who loves, of one who seeks by means of his gaze to drink in, as it were, and make his own the beloved upon whom he gazes. The saints all gazed at Mary in this way. St. Maximilian described Mary as his fixed idea, an idea or notion that never left his head because he didn't want it to. She was everything to him because in her, through her, and by her, he possessed God. When a soul consecrated to Mary has been notably purified of sin, it finds itself able to gaze at her in this way in its own heart. It finds her within its own being. This is a very great mystery and a great joy to those who experience it. But we cannot see her thus until she reveals herself. And so, dear brothers and sisters, we must bide our time and labour patiently so as to be able to receive this great grace from God if he should see fit to concede it to us. Here, we ought to discern a powerful motive for avoiding sin, especially the little sins of every day that keep us from this beautiful beholding of Mary. And if she does once reveal her glorious face and her entrancing sweetness to us, then no suffering will seem too great in the attainment of perfection or in the service of the King. But we may not only gaze at Mary, we can also gaze with her. In Eastern iconography, there are three basic types of icon of Mary. One is called Mother of God, Eleusa, or loving kindness. In this icon, Jesus' little face is near that of his mother. The artist often illustrates a great spiritual mystery, that is, Mary's conformity to Christ through grace, by depicting her face as being very similar to that of her son. But the point that I want to make now is that they are close to one another and that they are gazing together out, as it were, of the frame of the picture. That is, they're gazing towards us, perhaps, who behold the image. This image is a symbol of how we should pray with Mary, and it applies in a special way, perhaps, to our praying of the Holy Rosary. We must be like that child in her arms who, pressing his face to that of his mother, gazes together with her. We must gaze with her, that is, with all the dispositions of her heart, from her own perspective. We must gaze with her at the mysteries of her Son's incarnation, life, death, resurrection, and ascension into glory. If we ask Our Lady to help us to gaze with her at Christ, then not only will we find ourselves able to encompass a great deal of the mystery of Christ with our gaze, but, well, I think the two things are related. Sharing in Mary's dispositions, we will be able to enter into that mystery, those mysteries, at a very deep level. And perhaps one of the most beautiful things then that comes about is compassion. Compassion, whereby we begin to share in the quality of Mary's love as one who compassionated the sorrows of Christ. And then through all of this, we will find something very beautiful has taken place. If we recall to mind that image that I was describing and how baby Jesus' face is like that of his mother, we who place ourselves in the position of Christ and gaze outwards with Mary, when we do this and we gaze with Mary at Christ, we will find that we have acquired his very own features. We have become very truly Mary's child. So, dear brothers and sisters, let us persevere and pray the rosary in this spirit, and we will see its wonderful effects. Now, I want to just briefly finish by mentioning something else. We mentioned Mary's presence in the soul of those who are consecrated to her, of those who love her and acknowledge her as their true mother. To such souls, Mary is a true star, a true guide and teacher. I want to read you a little account written by a servant of God called Mary of St. Teresa, a Carmelite tertiary from, if my memory serves me correct, 17th century, an account which she gave of her own interior life. She writes, "Mary infuses light and knowledge into me so that I might know and practice virtue better. Whenever I do something at odds with perfection through ignorance, she immediately guides me to correct myself, giving me additional light and prudence. Similarly, when my interior purity is diminished by some contamination of the inferior powers of my soul, or through having considered creatures too much outside of the divine unity, she teaches me to purify my soul in God, to separate it from all that is not God and deiform. It seems to me that a ray comes from her maternal heart, giving me light, in which I see these things and the firm will to practice them." So, dear brothers and sisters, you see how beautifully this holy soul describes Mary as one who sheds a ray of light that introduces us more profoundly into the mystery of God. This, of course, we know very well, was very much the experience of those little shepherd children at Fatima, who described seeing Our Lady in an incredible light, in a light, they tell us, which was God. Mary brings them into the midst of this light. Let us then consecrate ourselves to Mary, if we have not already done so, with all our hearts. And if we have done so, let us renew it with a greater, more deep resolution than ever before, so that she might guide us to a greater love, and from thence to the harbour of eternal salvation, to the praise and glory of God, now and to endless ages. Amen. Now